It is 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning indeed to you. I hope you had a splendid weekend, and that the week ahead is looking rather lovely. Of course, if you are one of the people facing a deportation or relocation to Rwanda, then obviously you're not going to be in that category of people who are looking forward to the week ahead, and that, I suppose, is the point. I know this will sound as if I'm trying to stoke up tensions or incite a little bit of disagreement or unpleasantness, but I'm really not. I think the world is divided into two camps, or the country is divided into two camps, both of which know that the plan to deport people who've risked their lives to come to the United Kingdom for reasons of family or language or simple admiration of our magnificent culture and history, deporting them to Rwanda is objectively appalling, as Prince Charles reportedly said this weekend. A rare break, of course, with royal convention, although I do find the use of the P word in these contexts a little bit odd, because I don't know if it counts as being political. I mean, I don't know if you've read the Bible, but the idea, for example, that the Archbishop of Canterbury should stay out of politics is literally impossible. The Bible is the mother of all political tracts. It's hard to think of a more political book than the Bible. It's more political than Das Kapital or Mein Kampf. It's a supremely political book. Every single page of the New Testament certainly is dedicated to the idea of how societies should function, or contingent upon the prescription for how people should treat each other. Well, should stay out of politics. And the idea that the head of state or the next head of state should stay out of matters of state, it is a little odd. I know the Queen's done a pretty good job over the years, apart from that hat she wore one time, the European Union hat she wore to deliver a Queen's speech. I can't think of much she's ever done that might be construed as political. I think she had a little wave, didn't she, at the Scottish independence referendum. It became known, obviously, that she'd be opposed to that, but I don't think you win any prizes. For Michael Gove, didn't Michael Gove disgrace himself by claiming that the Queen was actually in favour of Brexit? I may have got that wrong, but with Michael Gove, you have to check what day it is before you can establish which direction he's blowing in on that occasion. He's the fella, of course, who pulled out of Boris Johnson's first tilt at the leadership on the Conservative Party on the grounds that he's completely untrustworthy. And Michael Gove currently, of course, sits in Boris Johnson's cabinet. So 6 minutes after 10 is the time. The conversation about Rwanda is not the conversation that most media outlets have. It is appalling, but some people like that. It took a very simple statement some years ago for me to understand part of the appeal of Donald Trump's rhetoric and bloviations on immigration issues or even issues of refugees. And it was very simply stated that the cruelty is the point. The cruelty is the point. And once you understand that, it almost ceases to be a subject of division and disagreement. The cruelty is the point. So when Prince Charles says this is appalling, this is an appalling thing to do, everybody knows he's right. It's just that some people, whether they're prepared to publicly admit it or not, and some are, some aren't, for obvious reasons, some people really like that. Look, here are some people that are the kind of people that perhaps featured in that disgusting poster that Nigel Farage released in the middle of the Brexit campaign on the morning that Joe Cox was assassinated by a white supremacist terrorist, that breaking point poster. You are persuaded that these are the kind of people trying to come here, and they are, of course, Schrodinger's immigrant. They are both coming here to steal our jobs, yet also to live a life of lazy leisure while claiming benefits. And no matter now that pretty much every sector under the sun is screaming out for labour and for people, we don't want these ones coming in because Farage has been down in Dover with his Fisher-Price binoculars, and nobody's got the wit to realise that the last time you listened to him and let him set the political agenda, we ended up becoming the first country in the history of humanity to impose economic sanctions on itself. But here he is again with another ludicrous racist hobby horse, and this time you can actually see the people that he's cross about, getting out of leaky boats, having risked their lives to cross the channel, and you've been persuaded to hate them, so you want them to be treated appallingly. I mean, I don't like that position that you've been persuaded into. I don't admire it, and I certainly wouldn't defend or excuse it. But I find it hard to get angry with you. It's a fairly visceral response, isn't it? It's a fairly primal response to the effort that's been put into persuading you that they're scumbags. You've been persuaded to believe that they're scumbags, therefore you want them to be treated like scum, which involves deporting them to Rwanda. And it doesn't really matter what happens in Rwanda. Oddly, in the scale of sympathy, I feel quite sorry for Rwanda, if it's possible to feel sorry for an entire country, because it is, a country that is emerging from decades of difficulty. It is a country which, by comparison with its nearest neighbours, is making a pretty good fist of things. It has problems, obviously, both current and historical. But the idea that we're sitting in the United Kingdom talking about it as if it's a sort of rubbish pit or tip, as if it's some sort of appalling destination to which nobody could possibly ever wish to go, is not fair. It has a growing tourist industry, for example. So it's not so much that they're being sent to a horrible place, because I don't necessarily think that they are. It's simply the case. Well, there's two things that need to be understood and observed. The first is, of course, that this is a scheme that transports people across the world against their will for essentially financial reasons. I think it's 120 million quid that's been paid to the Rwandan government to accommodate people who are being transported across the world against their will. Now, that is a description which you could also apply to slavery. It's not the same as slavery, obviously, because these people are not being put to work or chained up or anything like that, or bought and sold as chattels, as belongings, but they are being transported halfway across the world against their will. And it is being done in order for the people at the receiving end to make money out of their transportation. That's pretty gross, however you dice it. That is pretty gross. But I say again, I'm not comfortable with the portrayal of Rwanda as being some sort of refuse tip on the edge of hell, because it clearly isn't. But again, that's not the conversation we're going to have on this program. The other point you have to remember is that we know that it's possible to process applications in other European countries, because we did it with Ukraine. Do you remember when we were talking about why they couldn't put a processing centre in Calais, when the Ukrainian refugee scheme, mean-spirited and poorly conceived though it was, the worst in comparison to every other country in Europe by a country mile, but you remember when we were puzzled briefly as to why they couldn't have a proper processing centre in Calais. I think at one point they'd even said that they could, or that they did have one, and it turned out to be a bloke with a sort of trestle table and a packet of crisps. Why couldn't they have a processing centre in Calais for Ukrainian refugees who'd managed to get there? You remember we spoke to people, and we spoke about people who'd got to Calais, but then had to turn around and make their way back to Paris or somewhere else in order to apply through the correct channels. And the simple reason why they couldn't do it in Calais was that plenty of potentially bona fide applicants, bona fide refugees from other countries other than Ukraine, would also turn up. So you can process these applications more successfully or more efficiently, but of course this government doesn't want to, because of the breaking point poster that has been injected into the bloodstream of the Conservative Party and much of the Brexit voting population. And I think the third point we need to remember before we open up the phone lines is pretty simply the notion that we do more than other countries do. That's not an opinion, that's counting. We just don't. We simply don't shoulder a bigger burden of humanity fleeing war and tragedy than comparable European countries. And also, again, things that you have been persuaded but which are not true, and it doesn't matter how loudly you shout them from the rooftops, they will never be true. You are not required under refugee international law governing refugees. You are not required to stop in your first safe country. It's simply not true. And why would you want to, for example, stop in a country like France, which relatively recently was looking like it might elect an actual fascist? If you're fleeing a Middle Eastern country or an African country, would you want to settle in a country that has come close to electing an actual fascist? And of course, at this point, you might point out to me that we have a fairly far-right administration in place in this country, but I would suggest to you that though it's bad, it's nowhere near as bad as a Marine Le Pen. 30 minutes after 10 is the time. So I think that's the question. It's not really designed to address the described problem. This scheme is designed to create a problem. It's designed to create legal battles that allow dishonest journalists to talk about lefty lawyers. The only circumstances in which a court can stop deportations from happening is if a court finds them to be illegal. It can postpone them while the case is being considered, which didn't happen on Friday but may happen today on appeal. But the permanent decision, when it's handed down, will be solely about the idea of law. If it is illegal, then the courts will stop it from happening. It's got nothing to do with the star signs, the political leanings, or the football teams supported by lawyers representing these people. It is solely about whether or not a court finds the act is legal or illegal. But you know that because you listen to this programme. If you were taking all of your news from the Daily Mail, you wouldn't know that. You'd think that this is some sort of political conspiracy. And their front page today, as we predicted a couple of months ago, new Rwanda flight farce. The government proposes to do something that may well be illegal. Most experts seem to think it is illegal. And it's all the fault of lawyers. That's really dangerous. You know, we used the F word a moment ago in the context of France, but that's what fascists do. Launch attacks upon the rule of law. And we're seeing it in Northern Ireland as well today, which we'll get on to later in the programme. So, I don't know. This is an odd thing for a phone-in host to say. I don't know whether or not it's worth talking about this. We'll talk about it today because it's so clear and present. But I don't know that anyone changes their mind because we are all agreed. There is 100% agreement that this is appalling. So all you do is divide the population between people who love it because it's appalling and people who hate it because it's appalling. And I don't know that twain will ever meet. I could be wrong. It may be that when you are made aware of the fact that A, we do not do more than other European countries, B, these people are not having their applications processed in Rwanda. They can't come back. They're moving to Rwanda, full stop. If their applications are accepted, they're invited to make a new life in Rwanda. If their applications are rejected, I'm not entirely sure what happens. They probably get deported somewhere else. So we don't do more. They're not having their applications processed in Rwanda with a view to coming here. And when these facts are clearer, and you're not required by any conventions to stay in the first safe country you reach, when that's understood, maybe people will change their position a bit, but possibly because of the rather bleak lessons of the last few years, I just don't believe that, really, to be true. I don't buy it anymore. Am I right or am I wrong? 0345 6060 973. Is there any point having this conversation? Because I contend, I put it to you this morning, that because the cruelty is the point of the whole policy, there's no point shouting about it. There's no point wringing your hands. There's no point crying into your Earl Grey this morning, because however disgusted you are, however angry you are, however ashamed you are, that's the point. Not only is it designed to appease vile racists who love the idea of desperate foreigners being treated appallingly, it's also designed to prompt your tears. It is literally designed to make you gnash your teeth and wail so that these people who love the idea of desperate foreigners being treated appallingly not only get the hit, the endorphin hit, the dopamine boost of seeing Afghan refugees deported to a country they may never have heard of before, but they also get to see all the lefty, hand-wringing liberal Ramonas, or whatever ludicrous insult they're reaching for today, having a fit of the vapours about the continuing demolition of our international reputation and our Christian history. People love it. So what's the point of talking about it? 0345 6060 973. Given that everybody knows it's appalling, and we divide simply into two camps, one of whom hate the fact that it's vile and appalling, and one of which loves the fact that it's vile and appalling, is there any point having these conversations? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And if you've changed your mind on it, if you have, as a consequence of finding out more or listening to this programme or reading around the issue, if you've realised, if you've gone from cheering the Nazi imagery of that breaking point poster to recognising that you're better than that, we're better than that, and Britain needs to be better than that. I'd love to know what tipped you back in towards the light and whether or not you think it's worth people like us even having these conversations. So the day that decent people stop being upset and disgusted is the day that evil wins. But being upset and disgusted doesn't have to be a public practice. What is achieved by giving these people what they want, by saying this is gross, this is disgusting, this is racist, this is horrible, this is cruel, because they want it. Or I keep saying they, perhaps I mean you. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. I mean, it's a bit odd to say, here is the topic that we're discussing today. Is there any point discussing it? I grant you. So I guess the question that I want you to answer is, why is the government doing something so obviously ridiculous? 0345 60 60973. Afghans and Syrians, no one disputes the fact that they're fleeing horrors, are being deported to Rwanda, potentially. I'd be interested to see how many people end up on that plane. I think the figure's already down to 11, and that's being appealed in the High Court as we speak. But Afghans and Syrians genuinely fleeing, you have to presume genuinely fleeing war, if their applications are successful, they stay in Rwanda. And there's also a bit in the fine print of the deal that says we will take some of the most vulnerable refugees currently in Rwanda will come to this country. So I think it's clear that nobody, well, you tell me, why is the government imposing or seeking to introduce such ludicrous legislation? And I'll take any answer you've got on that, even the bleeding obvious. 23 minutes after 10, some very good and important news for you first. The Brexit backer, in fact, we spoke about that disgusting poster, the man who essentially bankrolled it, Aaron Banks, you'll remember him, has lost his libel action against the Observer and the Guardian journalist Carol Cadwallader. Carol Cadwallader, still awaiting an apology from the scrupulously impartial former BBC presenter Andrew Neil, of course, has been more maligned and more viciously attacked than pretty much any journalist I can remember in all of my years of doing this job. And I know that she's been brought to the very brink with the stress, the horrors and the costs of this case, because you don't generally sue journalists. If I say something, if I libel you in the next 20 minutes, tradition dictates, convention dictates that you sue LBC, because I can't afford to fight a big libel action against a multimillionaire, not unless I get lucky with crowdfunding or I win the lottery or sell a kidney. So when a multimillionaire comes after an individual journalist, the calculation may often be, I don't know about this case because thankfully I can't read what passes for Aaron Banks' mind, but the calculation may well be that you can almost cow them into submission, as we've seen with a lot of Russian oligarchs trying to close down book publications. The calculation may well be that you can't cow a big operation like a global radio or the Times newspaper or in this case the Observer, but you might be able to crush an individual. But it was far from an open and shut case. I didn't predict which way this was going to go because I wasn't sure. But Aaron Banks has been humiliated today in the most obvious and clear of fashions after he lost his libel action against Carol Cadwallader. And what he was suing over were two instances in which she said that the businessman was lying about his relationship with the Russian state, one in a TED talk and the other in a tweet. Her lawyer had argued that the case was an attempt to silence the journalists reporting on matters of the highest public interest, namely campaign finance, foreign money, and the use of social media messaging and personal data in the context of, wait for it, the EU referendum. And Carol has been to hell and back. So today I hope that she will allow herself several moments of satisfaction. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. To the phones. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to deport people to Rwanda, despite the fact that it probably won't work in many cases, and it is obviously appalling? 0345 6060 973. Catherine's in Muswell Hill. Catherine, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say, well, I want to address specifically what Boris Johnson said this morning when he was being interviewed by Nick Ferrari.
Okay, you'll have to bring me up to speed with that.
Okay, so it's a line that's been used a number of times. It's not original one. That they are jumping the queue and, not using safe and legal routes. And for every Ukrainian
but there aren't any safe and legal.
Precisely, that's my point. There are no safe and legal routes.
And was Johnson picked up on that? Again, you'll have to...
They can't jump a queue that they're not allowed to join.
No.
If you're not allowed in the queue in the first place, you can't jump it. You have to use another means. Further, under international law, people are allowed to arrive in a country, any country, which is a signatory to those treaties, to those laws, and to seek asylum in that country. And I'm not claiming it's a perfect situation. I'm not claiming that...
Well, of course it isn't. A perfect situation would be a world in which nobody wants to seek asylum because they don't have to.
Exactly. So it's so... and the other spurious argument that seems to be flying... So the safe and legal routes is a spurious argument because there are no safe and legal routes. We've cancelled them all. We've taken them all away. Yeah. Secondly, the idea that, because you haven't got a better idea, we're going to use this idea.
But we have got a better idea. We did it with Ukrainians.
But that would just go back to creating safe and legal routes. So yes, the better idea would be safe and legal routes. Having taken away the safe and legal routes, people often say, well, there's no better idea. We want to destroy the business model of the people traffickers.
Yes.
So what? So by becoming people traffickers ourselves, we're going to... But
also, if you're landing on a beach in Kent and you know that by going through the official channels you face deportation to Rwanda, then you're going to avoid the official channels as desperately as you can. You're going to...
Agreed. I mean, it's just... I just don't understand just from a purely logical...
I think you do.
Well, I understand some of the motivation, some of the fears and the anxieties that this is feeding into. Yes, I do. My own... the other point I think is worth mentioning is that people often come up with, are they economic migrants or are they genuine asylums?
What does that mean?
Well, in my
it means they're people who want to work.
It means they're people who want to work. It means that there are people for whom the term economic migrant and asylum seeker might also apply. If I look at my own family history, my father emigrated from Romania in 1938. That was before the Second World War. By that point, there were plenty of economic reasons why a Jewish family would need to emigrate because they
When did economic migrant become a pejorative? Because that means somebody seeking to come here and work hard and make a contribution to our society, and people like Farage, who's been sponging off.
I do think there is a legitimate argument to say, we want to protect a sort of indigenous workforce. We want to assure people that the
indigenous workforce doesn't.
Hang on, let me.
I will. I'm just telling you some numbers, which I'm sure you're aware of. We've currently got more vacancies than we've got unemployed people in this country.
I agree, and I really do accept and understand everything you're saying. I'm trying to meet the particular arguments that are put up from the other side, if you like. So when people like Boris Johnson, like certain callers who come in and say, well...
Not to me, sadly. They don't tend not to ring me anymore, although I must stress my phone lines are always open, and if people want to talk about why they love this scheme, I'm all ears.
Well, I've listened to a number of callers and a number of invited guests put out those arguments, the ones that I'm just
But they're so obviously spurious, which leads me to question what's really going on here. And the answer is, as we've said, the cruelty is the point. I suppose if you're not prepared to publicly admit that you love the idea of traumatised people who've fled Syria or Afghanistan being treated like absolute scum, if you're not prepared to say that, you need to come up with something like... So Johnson knows what he's doing. He knows exactly who he's appealing to, people who love the cruelty. But he can't say that out loud.
He has said it out loud in terms. In
terms, he can't actually say we're doing it because the kind of people that vote for me and voted for Brexit love the idea of treating these foreigners like absolute scum. They love it, but he can't say that out loud, so he has to say, well, we're trying to break the business model of the people smugglers, which I think puts victims of people smuggling in a very rare category of being blamed for the crimes that they're victims of, or punished even for the crimes that they are victims of. Catherine, thank you. Phone lines are open, 0345 6060973. If you're just joining us, that libel battle that's been bubbling away for some time is now over. Carol Cadwallader, a journalist, has won, or rather Aaron Banks has lost his libel battle, and Carol Cadwallader has won. More on that in the course of the programme, and no doubt the course of the day on LBC. Time now for the very latest headlines with Dominic Ellis. 10:35 is the time. It's also such a strange calculation, isn't it? As the reality of Brexit becomes ever more obvious and ever harder to ignore, whether you're talking about the situation arising with regard to Northern Ireland or whether you're talking about our economic performance, GDP down last month. I think presumably Boris Johnson will still claim that we've got the fastest growing economy in the G7, even as it shrinks. And one of the key architects of Brexit being, of course, Nigel Farage. And yet Boris Johnson has adopted to jump on another Farage-flavoured bandwagon now by going after people arriving in leaky dinghies on Kent beaches. I bumped into an old pal of mine who I hadn't seen for a while on Friday. And he is teaching refugees English. He does it for adults, but also in a local school. And one of the boys he teaches is Iranian and arrived here in a dinghy without any adult companions. Just think about that if you've got a child at home. He's yet to speak in any language. His written work is coming along nicely. He's learning English. But he's yet to say a single word out loud in any language. It's incredible, right? And I can tell you today it's reported that people whom the Home Office had judged to be adults in a relatively arbitrary process, because I'm pretty sure that if I'd crossed the world in pursuit of safety and exposed myself to all manner of horrors and potential exploitations, stresses and traumas, I wouldn't be as fresh-faced as I would be if I'd been waking up in my bed in Kidderminster every morning. So the Home Office gets to decide, essentially, who is an adult. And once they've decided you're an adult, you could get sent to Rwanda forever. They don't come back if I wonder how many people knew that today. Even if you are one of the people who revels in the cruelty and the callousness of this policy, and I can see you. It's not an insult or anything like that. It's just a description of fact. You love it. I hate it. You love it for the same reasons, because it's appalling. Did you know that they can't come back, even if they turn out to have completely copper-bottomed claims, even if they are fleeing torture, fleeing the worst sort of oppression, if they're literally on a Taliban hit list? They can't come back to the UK. They're in Rwanda forever. 0345 606 0973. So why is Boris Johnson doing it? Jonathan's in Maidenhead. Jonathan, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning. I'm a bit nervous because I've been listening to you from day dots, but this is the first time I've got the courage to call you.
Well, thank you, but there's nothing to be nervous about. It's only me.
Okay. My thing is this. The Farages and the Borises have always said we don't have the infrastructure, doctors, schools to accommodate all these brown and black people. But when people came from Hong Kong, where did the infrastructure come from? When people came from Ukraine, where did the infrastructure come from? This has only happened in the last 2 years.
Yes.
So that's my question to all the people who keep banging on about infrastructure.
Well, I suppose if I were to imagine what it's like to inhabit their curdled soul, I would say something like, well, we can accommodate some people, but not all people. Therefore, we can find room for Hong Kong citizens or for Ukrainians, albeit we're doing less than every other country in Europe. But, obviously, we can't let everybody in, which is where the statistic about what we do in comparison to every other country in Europe becomes pertinent. There's no logical or intellectual defence of this. There's no moral or even perhaps legal defence of this. That's the point, isn't it, Jonathan? It is objectively disgusting. The problem is you and me hate it because it's objectively disgusting. But, Gary Buncher numbers over there with his bulldog avatar and his Union flag underpants, he loves it precisely because it's disgusting. For exactly the same reasons that you hate this, he loves it.
Exactly. So, for me, it's my conundrum. It's like people bang on about infrastructure. Nigel Farage was always saying infrastructure. We don't have enough schools. I see people on the road, people speaking on the train and blah, 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 blah. But can you tell me, these guys from Hong Kong, have we heard anything about them? Tons of them are in this country.
I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, I know that the freedom to come here was established, but how many people took up the offer, I don't know. Because in a sense, I don't care. I'm not worried by it. I'm not thinking...
No. What I'm trying to say is...
I know what you're trying to say, but...
Nobody worried about infrastructure. Nobody worried about schools. They've got children.
Didn't have right-wing front pages going on about where are we going to put all these Hong Kongers?
Exactly,
how are we going to
saying.
find room for them?
Exactly.
And
That's
then, of course,
point.
in a way, when they accidentally called the public's bluff with the Ukrainian refugee scheme, so many people came forward offering up a spare room that the government couldn't cope and didn't even try to cope, didn't even pretend to cope.
I know you don't like me. You don't like people talking about your colleagues on the radio. But
No, I really don't know.
Yeah, okay, all right. No, Nigel Farage.
You can talk about him. He's not here anymore. You can say what you want about him.
No. What's his name?
No, leave it, mate. I wouldn't come to your place of work and start slagging off your
Okay, at least you got my gist anyway. So.
Of course I've got your gist. All you need to do is talk about right-wing columnists. They all say the same thing. They all sing from the same rancid Rupert Murdoch-flavoured hymn sheet. You don't have to single people out by name who I'm likely to bump into in the lift later today or cross in the corridor because they all say exactly the same thing. We can't cope. We can't cope. We can't do this. We can't do that. And then, of course, when they decide that some refugees are worthy of our protection and our support, then they can't really work out why. What is it? What could it possibly be, Jonathan, about Ukrainians that distinguishes them in the minds of some people from Afghans and Syrians?
Say it again?
What could it possibly be about Ukrainians that allows some people in the right-wing media to view them very differently from Afghans and Syrians? I can't quite put my finger on it.
The skin colour, that's all I can say.
Don't be ridiculous. That would make them racist. Have a good day, Jonathan. Nothing to be nervous about, as I said. Paul's in Guildford. Paul, what would you like to say?
Oh, James, I've got a bone to pick with you.
Here we go.
I never used to be politically engaged until I started listening to you.
Oh, well, I feel I should apologise in that case. I bet your life was happier.
Angry on a daily basis.
Well, yeah, but it's righteous anger, Paul. It's righteous. It's righteous anger.
I know. It was a lot better when I didn't understand the EU. But in this one, I mean, we all know why they're doing it, don't we?
Well, you put it into words, though, because we've all got feelings, and but it's worth articulating.
Well, it's like you say, there's two camps, isn't there? There's people that love it and it's fantastic because we haven't got money and all this, and we've got people that care. But left wing has now become good or nice, isn't it? It's become like a word for you're nice, so you're left wing. From people that don't really understand what that means. But my thing is, they use this line, don't they, that we're doing it to try and stop the traffickers. We're trying to stop the traffickers. And we all even they would admit that, the people being trafficked are the victims and the traffickers are the criminals.
Yes.
So in what other crime do you punish the victims to stop the criminals? You don't
imagine you get burgled. You get burgled and the old bill turns up and tells you that you're getting deported to Rwanda for the offence of having been burgled.
It's crazy. And
It's
I'm
incredible.
a member of the cabinet, but it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's you wouldn't do it. There's a load of bank robberies happening. Well, let's shut down the banks to stop the bank robbers. It just doesn't make any sense.
Do you want to hear something even worse? And I appreciate what you said about me being politically engaging to you and therefore you constantly. But I'll read you a line that may have been missed by some. It's in the Times about halfway down the story. The British Dental Association has said it does not recognise the Home Office's technique of using dental checks to work out a migrant's age, which has led the Refugee Council to conclude that among the 130 people initially due to be on that flight tomorrow, they believe children were included, several under 18. And that sentence there is a source of, I would say, immeasurable national shame. The British Dental Association has said it does not recognise the Home Office's technique of using dental checks to work out a migrant's age.
It's ridiculous. And like you said, we all said it, as soon as they announced this, in the first announcement, said legal charges, they knew there'd be legal charges. They knew it would probably be stopped, and it was never the point to actually make it work, was it? It was never the point.
I don't believe it was. I mean, certainly the front pages, the targeting of left-wing lawyers, the idea of Priti Patel's magnificent crusade to deport people like our own parents to the other side of the world would have been designed to sort of stoke up fury, stoke up anger. I don't know whether it works or not. And I find myself baffled, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, by why, now that Brexit is falling apart around our ears, why on earth would Boris Johnson take up a shop-soiled Nigel Farage policy and try and tarted up for the Daily Mail readers? I just don't know. Maybe because they can't do anything else. All they can do is break things and hurt people. Didn't his own girlfriend say that to him in that argument that got recorded by a neighbour? You've never taken responsibility for anything. I forget the precise words. 10:45 is the time. It's not all bad news, of course. Aaron Banks, you remember him. I suppose he would have bankrolled that disgusting quasi-Nazi poster, wouldn't he, given that he was the money behind the Leave.eu campaign. It was certainly involved in bankrolling that campaign. He's lost his libel action against Carol Cadwallader, which Theo Usherwood will talk us through in a little more detail after this. It's 10:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That I don't think it is disputable in the context of what Prince Charles said. This plan to deport people to Rwanda is appalling. But what many people miss, myself included until relatively recently, is that that's the point. So no one disagrees. Of course it's appalling. We just divide. I'm not going to suggest that we divide along a 52%, 48% division, because that would be churlish of me. But we divide, I don't know what the numbers are, along this line. I think it's disgusting, therefore I hate it. And I think it's disgusting, therefore I love it. These people have been treated appallingly, that's gross, versus these people are being treated appallingly, that's brilliant. And maybe it's a bit more complicated than base racism. I don't know, maybe we need to be a little bit kinder and say you've been persuaded that these people are a threat to you. That's why the Nazi-style imagery of that Breaking Point poster was conceived and delivered. You're supposed to be frightened of these people, because if we've learned anything about these conversations over the last few years, it's when they never mean you. They never mean you. I voted to stop people coming here. Well, I'm from the European Union. Oh no, I didn't mean you. We've got to get rid of these. But well, I'm an economic migrant, I suppose. Well, no, I didn't mean you. Nigel Farage married to a German economic migrant. Oh, I didn't mean her. I didn't mean them. His own children speak foreign on a train. Oh, I didn't mean them. I didn't mean my child. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And yet here we are. Tory party still terrified of an even more right wing. However far they tack to the right, there's always room for more. You know, George Eustice was in UKIP. So tack to the right, become a party to which a former UKIP idiot can actually now be attracted. But there's still further to go. And what have you got left? Well, we've left the European Union. We haven't got freedom of movement. There's not really any meaningful grievances at all. Let's get cross about actual Afghans and Syrians in leaky boats risking their lives to come to the country that dropped bombs on their hometown. Yeah, let's attack them. That'll work. Oh, and throw some lawyers into the mix while we're at it. Speaking of lawyers, interesting developments in the High Court this morning. Or actually, it's an email, wouldn't it? This judgment would be handed down by email. Theo Usher would tell us more.
It's just been put live on the website because Aaron Banks has lost his libel action against the Guardian journalist Carol Cadwallader. He was suing Carol for allegations she made that he was linked to the Russian state, firstly in a TED talk and then in a tweet. Now, what made this claim stand out, James, was that Banks, who founded the Brexit campaign Leave.eu, was suing Carol personally rather than the newspaper that she worked for. That means that had she lost, she'd have been on the hook for £1 million in costs, plus any damages that had gone Banks's way. However, he has not won the case, and that's why Gavin Miller, who of course is the QC who represented Carol, said that it amounted to an attack on free speech. The judgment, which is on the website, is very interesting because it says in paragraph 14 of the summary, the major point of contention was whether the defendant's belief, that's Carol's belief, that publication was in the public interest was reasonable. The court found that it was. The defendant therefore succeeded in establishing a public interest defence under Section 4 of the Defamation Act 2013. So Carol has won this case, Banks has lost, and there will be plenty of people thinking that this is a good day for free speech.
Because the public interest is, I mean, it's nuanced. It's not a binary. That's why you need a judge. It's why people didn't call this. I didn't dare try and call which way this one was going to go, because it's a different burden of proof, if you like, than you would have in a criminal case. And the judge has found essentially that Carol Cadwallader acted in good faith throughout, and as a journalist was not seeking to damage Aaron Banks's reputation for nefarious or sinister reasons, but genuinely thought that what she was reporting was in the public interest.
Precisely. So because it was in the public interest, the judge has found that actually Banks's claim does not stand, and therefore he has found in favour of Carol, because, as you say, the judge has come to the conclusion that she was acting in good faith in putting the information out there and was not acting simply to defame Arron Banks.
Hard to exaggerate, I think, the toll this has taken on Carol personally, but I'll let her tell that story herself as and when she sees fit. But the decision to go after an individual journalist, they're called SLAPs, aren't they? SLAPPs. That's quite rare.
It's unprecedented that somebody, an individual, would go after a journalist. So usually what happens, James, is that if there is a case, it could happen at LBC, it could happen at any newspaper, then the newspaper or media outlet that broadcast that decision is sued by the claimant, and that the journalist is covered by that organisation. So they're not actually personally on the hook. But Carol Cadwallader was facing bankruptcy because, as I said, the costs were going somewhere between £750,000 and £1 million for both sides. She'd have to pay her own costs and, of course, Arron Banks' costs. Arron Banks, it should be said at this point, is a multimillionaire. He runs a very successful insurance firm.
Yes.
Carol is on a journalist's wage. I imagine it's quite a good wage, but she would not have been able to have met those costs. And, of course, any subsequent damages, which would have gone above the costs, could have gone well above the costs of the case.
And it may be appealed. So if you were, I'm just wondering whether we get our money back now from the crowdfunding of the potential that she has to pay her lawyers. In fact, speaking of, because it would be the journalist, very rare. If we said something now, it would be LBC, it would be Global Radio that got sued, and they will have insurance and indemnities and stuff like that, whereas poor little Theo and Jim, we got nothing.
It's more Theo than Jim.
We'd be, but so, to that end, I'm just going to correct something that I checked that after Friday's show, when I suggested that the Evening Standard was still owned by the Lebedevs, plural, father and son, and that therefore the Daily Mail would still be the business partner of a man who had been sanctioned in Canada. The father, I think, Alexander Lebedev, is no longer the owner of the Evening Standard and has had no role with the paper since 2016. So the Daily Mail is a business partner of a man who the security services reportedly advised against giving a peerage to, but not the father of that man, who is no longer has no role with the Evening Standard since 2016. So you see, in the interests of full disclosure and transparency, and the backdrop of legal action, I'm very happy to clarify that and to correct that point. Do we know what, Carol, any word on whether she's going to speak?
But we're chasing, of course, she
arranging to get her on full disclosure, actually, for months. But we both felt that we would wait until, and either way, and to win or lose, we'd wait until this particular result had dropped. Although Banks sort of squealing all over social media that he might appeal, and he can certainly afford to, as you've established. Theo Usherwood, many thanks indeed. Back to the Rwandan deportations, which seem unlikely to work in the sense of either breaking the business model of people traffickers, which is what is claimed, or indeed seeing many of these people who hail from, including other countries, places like Afghanistan and Syria, actually on the planes at all. And of course, if they get to Rwanda and their application is successful, they stay in Rwanda. So what's the point of this proposal? What's the point of this policy? 10:57 is the time. Lewis is in Peterborough. Lewis, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
Long-term listener, and just to say thank you for this show and what you do.
Well, I couldn't do it without you, Lewis, so thank you as well.
We learn a lot. I've actually met you, James, when one of your documentaries in the BBC, and I don't know how good your memory is.
Not great, but go on, try me. I don't want to run out of time before you've made your point.
Yeah, you are the guy. I'm the guy that said, I wanted to smell how a millionaire smells when I was talking to the Plumco guy. Do you remember that?
I think I do. It was a little bit strange then, and it's a little bit strange now, Lewis. Go on. What made you pick up the phone today?
I think Boris Johnson has done this purposely because I think he's gaining that he loses in court. Then during the elections next time, he's going to say, right, I've tried to do something and everybody else stopped me. So I'm trying to do something. He's going to use that for an election pledge to say, I am working hard to bring in changes to immigration and I'm being stopped.
But why is it so effective? I don't know what the numbers are, what the percentages are, but if Farage pops up to the even further right than the current Conservative Party and starts moaning and whining and agitating about these people, why are there a significant number of votes, enough votes for Johnson to care in that kind of scaremongering and provocation? What does it speak to in the minds of these people who are terrified of human beings they'll never meet?
Yeah, it's always going to be like that. I think race plays a massive, massive thing. And people sit back and think, we don't need enough. We don't need people of color. We just need our people here. That's basically comes to that.
And that old-fashioned bit about if we can encourage people to punch down, then they're not even going to look up, never mind punch up. So that notion that, here's someone who's threatening what little you've got. Don't ask questions about the distribution of wealth in this country. Ask questions about people coming over in pursuit of a piece of the pie, if you like. And the idea that the pie is finite is nonsense as well. Thank you, Lewis. Yeah. I'm glad you got through today, and thank you for your kind words as well. It's a funny old morning, and it's part of the reason why we tend not to have these conversations anymore, because of that skeleton key, that Rosetta Stone of understanding that landed surprisingly late on my head. Just the simple point that we all agree that this is disgusting and appalling. Prince Charles is right. The only difference is that some of us hate the policy because it's appalling and some of us love the policy because it's appalling. There are three constituencies, actually, because the second constituency, the people who love the policy because it's appalling, breaks down into those who will admit it, who tend to be anonymous or to have bulldog avatars, or occasionally will sort of poke their head above the parapet or possibly present programmes on some of these weird new channels, and those who are too ashamed to admit it, which I suppose is preferable, is it? It is 4 minutes after 11. We're developing a little arsenal of hardy perennials, aren't we? I don't know if you've noticed. The subjects that... I did a very pleasant public appearance in Lewes on Saturday night, the Lewes Speakers Festival, which is a lovely... I'm very blessed to be invited to these events. The downside of it is you've got to write a book before you can get invited to them. And luckily, given that my last book came out during lockdown, it's had quite a long tail of festival invitations. If I were to give any advice to aspiring authors, it would be don't get your book published when the bookshops are shut. But the silver lining to that particularly grim cloud is that I'm getting book festival invitations at least a year after I realistically should have been, given when the book was actually published, because so many festivals were curtailed or cancelled. So I was in Lewes on Saturday night and had such a lovely time. Thank you to everybody involved in that. But the number of people now who've taken to correcting me on how long I've been doing this job. So I don't like to count. It makes me feel old. But the number of people say, you keep saying you've been on the radio for X number of years, and I know for a fact I've been listening to you for X plus 2 number of years, because my first child wasn't even born when I started. Well, my first child wasn't even born when I started doing this. So I only mention how long I've been doing it because it's absolutely wonderful, thanks to you, largely, that I keep discovering new things that I love about the job. The questions that have become relatively frequent on the programme are relatively frequent because we haven't got the comprehensive answers yet. I love it. It's almost like the enlightened equivalent of constantly banging on about immigration or whatever it is, the kind of other side of the coin might do in these sort of contests, asking the same question again and again and again in the hope of getting a different result. But it's the opposite of that because we stumble across new things. I'm fascinated to know, for example, how we look to the rest of the world. I particularly, as we continue to behave in such a stupid and dangerous and probably illegal fashion everywhere from Rwanda to Northern Ireland. What do our admirers, what do our former admirers elsewhere think about this country? A pal of mine's just got back from Germany with some astonishing tales of how people... there's not even any Schadenfreude, which I believe is actually a German word. There's not actually any Schadenfreude. There's no pleasure in our misfortune. There's just bewilderment. What are you doing over there? What are you doing to yourselves? And I don't know the answer to that. So we had a wonderful show a couple of years ago where I said you can only ring in if you're listening elsewhere in Europe, and the switchboard lit up with people who were listening elsewhere in Europe. We may do something like that this week, now that Brexit is returning to the conversation, inevitably, as we knew it would. Did you see what David Davis said last night? That the reason everything's going badly is because we got a Remainers Brexit. All right, listen, we're not talking about Brexit today. We're about to talk about people leaving the jobs market, the over 50s, but I'm going to give myself till 10 past, all right? I'm going to give myself 2 minutes and 40 seconds or thereabouts to point a couple of things out to you, right? Ian Duncan Smith, you remember him? Ian Duncan Smith stood up in the House of Commons and laughed. He physically scoffed at the idea that the members of the House of Commons needed time to scrutinise the withdrawal agreement. He physically laughed. He sneered. He smugly sniggered at the very idea, the notion, the suggestion that he personally, never mind everybody else in the House of Commons, needed to scrutinise the withdrawal agreement. They knew that it was oven ready. They knew that the deal was wonderful, and they knew that they were going to get Brexit done. And now, of course, all of these people are poised to vote to undo it and to reopen negotiations. That's how mad it is. The government elected on a promise that it was oven ready. David Frost today tweeting about wanting to see the detail of what's going to be changed. He was tweeting not that long ago about how it was a brilliant deal and he deserved all manner of plaudits and praise because he was delivering something that could only be dreamt of. That's how mad it is now. Duncan Smith laughing at the idea that they didn't understand what was in it. And now the entire parliamentary Tory party whining and squealing about the fact that they didn't really understand what was in it, culminating last night in David Davis claiming that it was a Remainers Brexit. So that oven-ready deal that you voted for because Boris Johnson and David Davis and everybody else told you it was brilliant, it wasn't brilliant at all. Not only was it not oven-ready, but it was actually a Remainers Brexit. Whatever the hell that means. A Remainers leave. These people are as thick as mince, but the only thing bigger than their stupidity is their egos. And that's how you can have Hanan now writing about why we should have stayed in the single market. And David Davis, a man who, if you looked up pompous in a dictionary, there would quite possibly be a picture of him, claiming that it was somehow a Remainers Brexit. The oven-ready deal was not oven-ready at all. It wasn't even bloody defrosted. And Ian Duncan Smith laughing at the idea that they needed to actually scrutinise what was in the bill, what was in the withdrawal agreement, and now desperately trying to disown it. He even talked about 3 months later about the fine print. We've found in the fine print. The same man that stood up in the House of Commons and laughed at the idea that they needed to read it, complaining within months about stuff that he'd found in the fine print. That was about the repayment of debts. 2 quick points, and then I'll tell you what we're talking about this hour. Point 1, the manifesto in 2019, the Conservative manifesto, pledged no renegotiations. It categorically stated there will be no renegotiation of Brexit. That was the con. That was the oven-ready deception, categorically stated. And I can't remember whether it was everyone who stood in 2019 or whether it was simply new MPs standing in 2019. They all had to actually sign a pledge to Boris Johnson and David Frost's deal. They had to put ink to paper, I believe, it may have been verbal, pledging to support the deal, which this week they will be invited to vote to disown. So you have a manifesto pledge never to renegotiate, and they're trying to reopen negotiations now, and you have a public pledge of support for something that they're now being asked to publicly disown. That's how bonkers it is, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Least of all people who encourage you to vote for it because it would make your life better, or it would make food cheaper, or it would make the jobs market healthier, or it would make the economy stronger. 19th out of 20 in the OECD forecasts of economic performance next year. 19th out of 20. The only country below is Russia, which at least has the excuse of having had sanctions imposed upon it from outside, as opposed to Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain, which has imposed sanctions on itself. But we're not going to talk about that. I think you can tell, can't you? I've still got it. I could still do 3 hours a day on this. I mean, so deep is my disgust at what these people have done to our country. I could comfortably. It's quite reassuring to know that. It would be a bit like Neil Diamond ending up on stage and forgetting the words to Sweet Caroline. If I couldn't do 3 hours straight of Brexit-related material, pulling facts out of a hat like a magician would rabbits, if I'd lost that ability, my God, what would that say about the state of the nation? So I'm delighted to report that Neil Diamond can still sing Sweet Caroline, and I can still feel my dander rising as we begin to even list all of the calumnies, the egregious corruptions, the lies and the incompetencies that constitute Boris Johnson's oven-ready Brexit. Unbelievable. But here we are. I don't know if you were listening last month when we had a conversation about those numbers, those employment numbers, the fact that we had more vacancies in this country than we have unemployed people. And part of the problem with that statistic, even though inevitably Boris Johnson keeps standing up in the House of Commons and claiming that our historically low unemployment figures are an unalloyed good, that's another, well, again, it's a lie. You have to presume Boris Johnson is intelligent enough to understand why that is not an unalloyed good. Therefore, he is once again trying to deceive the public with the claim, as he does with the vaccines and all the rest of it. Bless his little cotton socks. But the thing we discovered that day, or the thing we worked out that day, was that a large part of this problem, and you're going to have to forgive me on one element of fine detail. I should know this, and I probably will know it by the time we come back to open up the calls. You have 600,000 people over 50 who have left the workforce since 2020. It's a piece in the Times today by the director of the Social Market Foundation, and it lands squarely on that territory that we stumbled across together the other day, when people were ringing me, particularly men in their 50s, were ringing me to say they've just knocked it on the head. They've walked away. Probably the last generation that would be able to do that in the context of pensions that won't be, gold-plated, but they'll be just generous enough for you to do a calculation and a few sums and have a look at the road ahead, and you may have paid off your mortgage and you've thought to yourself, do you know what? I'm going to call it a day. And we knew when we talked about that, because anecdotes never become data. The plural of anecdotes can never be data. But I can smell it sometimes on my switchboard. I can just smell a change in the weather, a change in the wind. And that happened on that day. I thought that's a big, big, big story. That is a huge part of the bigger picture. And today, reading this article in the Times, I stumbled across this paragraph. The real story of Britain's labour market isn't unemployment, it's inactivity. We've lost hundreds of thousands of people from the labour force, and unless we find ways to lure them back, our recovery from our current troubles will be even slower and sadder. Now, given that we have a Prime Minister who refuses to admit even the existence of the current troubles, this becomes an urgent problem when somebody with the qualifications of the director of the Social Market Foundation, writing in Rupert Murdoch's Times, concludes that if we can't attract or stem the flow of people moving out of the workforce voluntarily, then we've got a major problem on the horizon. Inactive people don't figure in the unemployment statistics because they're not available for work. So they could be sick, they could be studying, they could be caring for relatives or loved ones, or they could be retired. And before the pandemic, Britain's inactivity rate had been coming down for more than 30 years, slowly but steadily. Since COVID struck, it has gone up. Now, it may not prove permanent, and that's going to be the heart of the question I'm about to ask you next, but it could be. So, in the hope of coming up with an answer to the question of how could we stop this abandonment of the labour force, how could we stop people specifically over 50 leaving the workforce, I think the first step towards answering that question involves asking this question: why did you leave the workforce? There's 600,000 people. I'd like to offer a particularly warm invitation to women this morning because I think we spoke almost exclusively to men last time. The statistic I was looking at last time was very heavily skewed towards men, but I want to make it clear this is open to all. That's the simple question. And I particularly want to talk to you if you're slightly surprised to find yourself in this category. I mentioned to you last time a very good friend of mine who is nowhere near 60 and halfway through lockdown just had a little look at the road ahead. He's got a job that they absolutely adore, but reassessed, recalibrated, recalculated life, work-life balance, the road ahead, call it what you wish, and just thought, do you know what? I can and therefore I will retire in my mid-50s. Why are you doing that? Are you surprised to find yourself in that category? And if I were to ask you how we can stem this flow, what would you say? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Why did you leave the workforce in your 50s? And how would you answer the question of how we could stop other people doing the same? Because I've got a horrible feeling that second question is going to be pretty close to unanswerable. It's 11:17. It is 20 minutes after 11. Thank you to, I don't know what this means about how much time you've got on your hands, but thank you to everybody who's referred me to a tweet I put out in July of 2017, which the mathematicians among you will know is almost 5 years ago. People to blame for Brexit woes. Remainers, the EU, Lily Allen, Angela Merkel and the BBC. People not to blame for Brexit woes, Brexiteers. That was 5 years before David Davis claimed the reason everything was going wrong was because we had a Remainers Brexit. Honestly, I'd obviously need a microscope, but it's as if I could read his mind, isn't it? 5 years in the past. 21 after 11 is the time. Back to people in their 50s leaving the workforce. Why did you leave the workforce? And do you think other people can be stopped from following you? Because if they can't, we've got some fairly major problems, adding to the problems that we've already got. Veronica's in Sutton. Veronica, what would you like to say?
I've just joined the class of inactively what's it called? Economically inactive.
Yes.
As of the end of May, I'm now a free woman. I hadn't planned to be a free woman in this sense, because like most of us, I was planning to probably retire in my early 60s, and I'd financially planned for that. I still have a son who's got 2 more years of school, and he goes to an independent school, so I've got hefty school fees to pay as well. But after the pandemic, there was an opportunity to take redundancy, and I'd worked for my current employer. Well, I just left it now for 20 years. It was quite generous. It's not going to be a walk in the park financially, but
that's the bit that intrigues me most. It's the conscious decision to tailor your expectations, to tailor your standards of living, rather than to throw yourself back into the workplace. So what key factors prompted that decision, Veronica, specifically that decision?
I would say the last 2 years of the pandemic. I had a very successful career, and I've been fortunate to have a very high level of quality of life. Trips, travel, holidays. You name it. Had it all.
Yeah.
And I thought, what, I'm going to cut my cloth differently. It's not so important.
But why? Why?
Because
I'm going to label you. I'm going to badger the witness.
I'll give you an example. My brother-in-law had a catastrophic stroke just before the pandemic.
Right.
And I thought, my God, my sister's now become and so many people around me, and just like. What? Why are we working like this? For what? And since I just, there's more to life than just being on the corporate treadmill. Why do you want to have the big fancy holiday? But making memories is important.
Yes.
But
holidays are great though.
Yeah.
But 50, if you're working 48 weeks of the year in order to have 2 weeks on a beach in somewhere exotic, it's an odd trade-off,
but you can cut your cloth. You can still have that without having to go. I think we all. Well, I can speak for myself. I readjusted it, but then what I found is since I've sort of gone out in my circle of friends and old uni friends, I'm not alone.
No, well, you're clearly not alone. There's 600,000 of you, Veronica.
Well, I was recently at a party.
No, I mean you didn't go to university with all of them, but I mean there are in total 600,000.
But I'm 56, and I recently went to a birthday party with a friend from uni I hadn't seen in ages. And I sort of mumbled it to her, by the way. I just said, "Oh, you're kidding. Yeah, so am I. And she works in financial services. Another one who works. I mean, it was suddenly like, oh, I'm doing the same. So we're all meeting up for luncheon next week to have a celebration because we're all giving up.
What will be the biggest changes, do you think, materially speaking? I mean, I presume that you've paid off your mortgage, have you?
Yes.
Well, that's huge. See, that puts you in probably a unique generation now, or at least the last generation that's going to be in that sort of situation in your mid-50s. So you don't have to worry about that, which automatically puts you in a very lucky category. Although I appreciate you've worked hard to pay off your mortgage. There's plenty of people who will never be able to afford their own homes, who work incredibly hard as well, as you know. So what's going to be the biggest difference? The things that you perhaps, let's fast forward a few years, the things that you might have expected to be doing after retiring that you won't now do because you have recalibrated your finances?
I mean, I suppose, I was fortunate to go on like
it's going to be the holidays, isn't it?
Yeah, it was like all these discretionary spending, like, I'd probably go on about, I don't know, 4 to 6 big holidays a year. I mean, some of them longer, some of them shorter, maybe staying at, very expensive places. But I've learned, to be honest with you, that doesn't really matter. And what's more important is actually spending time with people who I want to spend time with, and doing things, even simple things, like learning to paint and doing stuff, or cooking. And I know it sounds really weird and a bit bohemian.
Doesn't sound weird at all. It's almost as if we've been conditioned since the Industrial Revolution to think that it is weird to prioritise self-care and the things you describe above the rat race, above the hamster wheel of existence. And it's not weird at all. It makes perfect sense. The only thing that's weird is that it took the pandemic for many people to realise this.
Yeah, and that's what my light bulb was, and I'm for sure not alone. There are many, and what's interesting is my sort of friend circle on that they're in very high-powered, successful roles. We were part of the corporate machine in different sectors.
Yes.
And we're all saying it's not worth it anymore.
That's the point. I'm going to crack on, Veronica, only because there's so many other people waiting to speak. But that's the point, is that without the pandemic, you wouldn't have had that weird moment of clarity where you thought, you know what? The world's not going to end if I don't do this. And you're sort of, not you personally, but the broad picture of being so puffed up with the importance of what it is that you do. I know I can be. That it never really occurs to you that it doesn't matter in the great scheme of things, and you might be personally happier being less puffed up with the importance of what you do. And of course, I suppose it's a silver lining for the economy, but not necessarily for the health of the population, to think that the further we get away from the pandemic, the less likely it becomes that people follow Veronica down the path out of the labour force, because it took something as profound and as unprecedented as the pandemic to make people realise what's the word I want? To make people realise that they had choices and agency, actually, that it didn't have to be like this. Sarah is in Ormskirk. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi, Jane.
Hello, Sarah.
I actually retired 3 weeks ago. I'm 55 and I was a nurse for over 36 years.
Right.
I don't know if you remember me, but you get lots of calls, I know, but I phoned in the middle of the pandemic. I run a care home scheme.
Yes.
And I was a frailty nurse practitioner, so it was my job really to look after the care homes, and that was before the pandemic hit, and then, of course, we had a few tough years then.
Yes.
So I think for me...
I do remember. Partly because my friend Jenny is from Ormskirk, and so whenever it pops up and I bumped into her the other day, whenever it pops up on the screen, I always think of her, and it doesn't pop up very often. I don't know what the population of Ormskirk is, Sarah, but
it's very small.
But it's small enough for me to remember every caller from Ormskirk, funnily enough.
Oh, that's good. So I few things happened. I'm only 55, but
right.
then I feel old at the moment.
Oh,
and
dear.
I think going through the work, any nurse that you speak to who went through working that, do you remember that lovely April where everyone said, the weather was great,
Yeah.
and everyone still talks about that, and I don't remember that because all I remember is coming home exhausted. And we were all the same. And I think I probably worked 50% harder in the last sort of 3 years than I probably did before. And my background's palliative care, frailty nursing. So we do a lot of,
That's brutal, isn't it? It's brutal.
It is when you're looking at, we talked about care planning and my job was to try and help people who were living with dementia not to go back into hospital. So there were all of those. And then we're on the background of, wrapping a, what was it? He said, wrapping a caring arms around the nursing home, it would never happen. Yeah. So I had all that anger as well. And that's the other interesting thing. I've got increasingly angry over the last 3 years. I love listening to you because it actually gets a lot of my anger out. But I've got increasingly angry about the way we have been treated and the way the NHS has been treated. Yes. But I think the one thing I wanted to say was that I'm lucky, James. I can go now because I get my full pension.
Yes. But actually, and I don't want anyone to think that we're not aware as we have this conversation that it is an immense privilege to be able to have these choices. Are the most valuable thing in the world, aren't they? Choices.
Absolutely. But what I'm worried about is the nurses coming behind me because they're expected to work till they're 67. And there's no way that nurses, doctors, physios, any of the therapy teams, any of the caring teams, you can't do it. It's physically and emotionally exhausting. And I feel so blessed that I can go. I think...